What is going on, guys? Welcome back. We're continuing our journey through the paper 2 GCSE psychology content, and in this episode we're going to be looking at obedience. So what is obedience? Let's start off with a definition. So obedience is a type of social influence, and it causes a person to act in response to a perceived authority figure. We're going to start by looking at Milgram's study of obedience from 1963. Now this is a massively important study for you guys to be aware of and for you guys to understand for your up and coming exam. So let's get on it. So the aim of this study was to investigate whether ordinary people would obey an authority figure when instructed to harm another person, even when this conflicted with their personal conscience. Now, interestingly, Milgram wanted to understand obedience in the context of the atrocities committed during World War II. The method. So this experiment included 40 male volunteers who were recruited via a newspaper advertisement. They were all aged between 20 and 50 years old, and they were from a variety of occupations. They were all paid $4.50 simply for turning up. So how did he go about conducting this experiment? So let's look at the procedure in some detail. So participants were told that the study was about memory and learning. They drew rigged lots so that the participant always became the teacher while a confederate became the learner. The learner was strapped to a fake electric chair in another room. The teacher read word pairs, and incorrect answers required the teacher to administer a shock, increasing by 15 volts each time, from 15 volts to 450 volts. The shocks themselves weren't real, but participants believed that they were. And if a participant hesitated, the experimenter used standardized prods, and these were things like, "Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on." The results of this study was that 100% of the participants continued to 300 volts. 65% obediently continued to the maximum of 450 volts, despite many showing signs of extreme stress. So things like sweating, trembling, stuttering, nervous laughter, and even seizures. Many participants protested, but they still obeyed the experimenter. And in conclusion, ordinary people are surprisingly obedient to authority figures, even when asked to inflict harm. Obedience is not due to personality, but due to situational factors, and these situational factors are things such as the presence of a legitimate authority figure, the prestigious setting, gradual commitment, so starting off with a small shock and then slowly increasing. So let's evaluate that study. So what are some of the strengths of this study? Well, there's a high level of control because it was a laboratory setting. So extraneous variables were minimized, allowing Milgram to clearly establish cause and effect between authority pressure and obedience. It was a standardized procedure. So all of the participants received the same instructions and prods, and this leads to high reliability and replicability. Practical and theoretical value. This helped to explain real-world obedience, including war crimes, and became a foundation for authority research in psychology. What about the weaknesses of this study? Well, there are clear ethical issues. Because there was deception, some participants were misled about the study's purpose and the reality of the shocks. So this could have led to psychological harm. Participants experienced significant stress, guilt, and even distress during the experiment. The right to withdraw was compromised. So remember the prods that the experimenter gave? These made it very hard for the participants to withdraw from the study. There was a low level of ecological validity. Remember, ecological validity is how much something represents the real world. So the artificial lab setting, giving shocks for wrong answers, is not like real life obedience scenarios. Sample bias. So remember, only male American volunteers were selected, and this limits the generalization to the wider population. So now let's look at Milgram's agency theory. So Milgram's agency theory is a psychological explanation for why people obey authority, even when it goes against their morals. It was proposed after his famous obedience experiment in the 1960s, what we just looked at. The core idea is that people shift between two states of behavior, the autonomous state and the agentic state. With the autonomous state, a person acts according to their own moral values. They feel responsible for their actions, and obedience is far less likely. The agentic state is when a person sees themselves as an agent for an authority figure. They transfer responsibility for their own actions to that authority, and obedience becomes more likely even if the action is harmful. So this shift from autonomy to agency is known as the agentic shift. But why do people enter the agentic state, you may ask? Well, it could be down to socialization. So we are raised to respect authority, things like parents, teachers, and institutions, and this conditions us to obey. The hierarchy. In structured settings, for example, like the workplace, the military, school, authority feels legitimate, making obedience feel expected. Binding factors. And these are things that keep people in the agentic state, things such as a fear of disrupting social order, fear of appearing rude or rebellious, and feeling committed once you've started. Also, rationalizing the situation. So, hey, look, it's not my fault, I'm just following orders. All of these things above reduce the moral strain of obeying. Adorno's theory. So Adorno argued that certain personality structures formed through early childhood experiences and reinforced by social conditions make individuals more likely to submit to authority, show aggression towards outgroups, and embrace rigid hierarchical worldviews. This work combined psychoanalysis, sociology, and empirical psychology, and this was an unused mix for its time. Adorno came up with what is known as the F or fascism scale. It assessed traits such as conventionalism, so strict adherence to traditional values, authoritarian submission, uncritical obedience to perceived legitimate authority, authoritarian aggression, hostility towards outgroups or rule breakers, anti-introception, so distrust of imagination, subjectivity, or emotionality, superstition and stereotypy, rigid thinking and beliefs in fate, power and toughness, admiration of dominance and strength, destructiveness and cynicism, so generalized hostility, projectivity, projecting one's forbidden impulses onto others, sexual repression, so moral strictness about sexuality. People scoring high on the F scale were theorized to be more prone to ethnic prejudice and support for authoritarian leaders. Now, this came from a psychoanalytic foundation. So Adorno linked authoritarian personality development to a punitive, hierarchical family structure. According to the theory, a strict, domineering parent, often conceptualized as the father, instills fear. The child represses aggression towards the parent because it is dangerous to express it, and this aggression is later displaced onto weaker groups, so things like minorities and outsiders. At the same time, the individual idealizes authority figures and seeks strong leaders to identify with. Thus, authoritarianism is both submission and aggression produced by repression. Social and cultural context. Adorno emphasized the authoritarian tendencies are not purely individual, but shaped by capitalist mass culture, which encourages conformity, propaganda and media manipulation, economic insecurity, which increases desire for order, rigid social institutions that reproduce hierarchy. Adorno saw authoritarian personality as a psychological response to modern society's alienation and powerlessness. Now, of course, no theory is without its criticisms, and fascism scale is the same in that regard. So some of the criticisms are that it's methodological. The F scale used leading questions always phrased in one direction. Agreement equals higher authoritarianism. Sampling was not diverse by modern standards. Its data analysis relied heavily on clinical interpretation, not just statistics. Criticisms from a theoretical standpoint is that it overemphasized psychodynamics, so the idea of repressed hostility and things like that. It assumed authoritarianism was primarily a right-winged phenomenon, though later research, example left-wing authoritarianism, complicated this. Criticisms from a cultural scale. This is rooted in a mid-20th century America and European context. Some aspects may not be generalizable globally. Now, despite this criticism, it remains foundational for modern research on prejudice, political psychology, and authoritarianism. Alright guys, hopefully that gives you guys a deeper insight into obedience, looking at Milgram and Adorno's theories. It's important that you guys have a good understanding of those, so please rewatch the video, make notes. Also, like and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.